we're going to go back now to our passage in Leviticus 23 to look at this next holiday, the holiday of Sukkot. And remember, Sukkot in our current rabbinic calendar shows up very early because it comes right after, oh, I didn't pin myself, darn it. Sukkot comes very early because it's right after the holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are new additions to this calendar because the festivals of the harvest are probably much older. So with that addition of the high holidays to the calendar, now Sukkot seems to follow right upon them and unfortunately often gets overshadowed. So we have, as I mentioned, the high holidays as we think of them now in the 7th month with the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the month. And then we have, immediately following in verse 33, on the 15th day of the 7th month there shall be the Feast of Booths, Chag HaSukkot. Sukkah is the booth or the tabernacle in some translations. The first day is a sacred occasion. The 7th day is a sacred occasion as well. And on the 8th day, you have another special event with an offering by fire. So this is actually a 7+1 holiday. So you've got the first day, 7 days you bring offerings, and on the 8th day, you have a closing event. In fact, it says, Hikravtem ishe liyave atzeret hi. It is a closing. Atzor is like to close or to stop. It's the end day, atzeret. Remember that. And so this says these are the days that you offer your sacrifices, but it repeats Sukkot actually in verse 39. Mark, on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the yield of your land, asefchem, it says here, ba'asafchem, just like the Chag HaAsif, the holiday of ingathering, it's the same verb. You observe the festival to Yahweh for 7 days, a complete rest on the first day, and a complete rest on the 8th day, again highlighting that 8th closing day. On the first day, you take the product of hadar trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you rejoice before Yahweh 7 days. So you have to take 4 different kinds of growing things to celebrate with. You observe it as a festival for 7 days. It's a law for all time. Basukot teshvu shivat yamim. You will sit or actually live, dwell in these booths for 7 days. Why? In order that future generations know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. So here we have a harvest festival that's been given an Exodus meaning. Right? Why Sukkot? Why live in there for 7 days? To remember the Exodus experience. Just like for Passover, you gird your loins and you carry your staff in your hand because you're reminding yourself of the Exodus story. That's how the priests are taking this agricultural festival and adding the Exodus narrative to it. Okay?
In this case, when they talk about booths, I helped build the thing 2 years ago, so I remember what it looks like. But do they actually mean tents? In this
They
didn't literally build themselves booths every night.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, sukkahs, as they were built in the biblical period, we're not quite sure of the materials. We have lots and lots of rabbinic laws about what they can be made out of and how big they can be, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we don't necessarily know what they were in this biblical period. Were they a tent? Were they a lean-to, just a side against a wall of something? Or was it actually a sukkah like we think of a sukkah today? I don't know. I'll be honest, I highly doubt they wandered in the desert for 40 years hauling this lumber around everywhere they went like we have it now. But, they also don't have to be as big as the one that we made for our congregation. That's a bigger scale than a family might have. The scaling would have been different. The other thing that's interesting about this description of the holiday in the Hebrew Bible is in the book of Numbers, it shows up again. But in Numbers 28 and 29, you get the list of all the animal sacrifices you have to offer for all the festivals. So if you're a vegetarian or vegan, do not read Numbers 28 and 29 because it will turn your stomach. And you'll see when it comes to talking about Sukkot specifically. So here, for example, on the 10th day of the 7th month, you have a sacred occasion of self-denial or afflicting your souls, as we talked about. You offer a burnt offering of pleasant odor, a bull of the herd, a ram, 7 lambs, and so on. And the meal offering is mixed in, 1/10 for each lamb, and there's a goat for a sin offering, and so on. But now on the 15th day of the 7th month, you observe a sacred occasion, do not do any work. 7 days you have a festival. You have a burnt offering, an offering by fire. On the first day, 13 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish. That's a lot.
Who can afford that except for only rich?
Well, it's sort of a national, not every person, but the nation offers this. The shrine offers this.
I thought it was like
Every person, no.
it's because they have a huge amount of stuff.
Right, no, the shrine offers this.
How did they decide who gave what?
Well, they had sort of a census of the people, and each tribe had to offer its, tithe. And well, of course, rich people are going to get out of it. I mean, what else is new? I'll give you one example of that. Actually, in later Jewish history, one of the ways that the Jewish community supported itself was they would put a tax on Shabbat candles or a tax on kosher chickens, and putting a tax on Shabbat candles is what we would today call a regressive tax, because it's the same for everybody, but guess who can afford it better? The rich rather than the poor. But the rich were the ones making the laws, so they got to decide how to tax people. Again, what else is new? So in the first night, you have 13 bulls and these other lambs and meal offerings along with them, and a goat for a sin offering. On the second day, 12 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish, and all the meal and a goat for the sin offering. Third day, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs. So you've got 2 rams a day for 7 days. You got 14 yearling lambs a day for 7 days. And then you've got 13, 12, 11 bulls counting down. Now, if you do the math, actually, you have 13 bulls on the first day. You have 7 bulls on the last day, right? And then 12 bulls on the second day and 8 bulls on the second to last day. When you're adding up a sequence of numbers, this is a nice math trick, you add the first and the last number and the next one down and the next one down, and they actually add up to the same thing. So 13 on the first day, 7 on the last day is 20. 12 on the next day, 8 on the day before the last day is 20. 11 and 9 is 20. So you have 20, 40, 60 plus 10 is 70 bulls. Nice key number, exactly. Nice round 70 bulls. Okay. So again, you feel the number 7 working through this calendar. Even if it's a 7+1 holiday with the 8th day, still with the sacrifices are definitely highlighting the importance of the number 7. Other traditions that were attached to this holiday, particularly by the rabbis. For example, they created all kinds of rules that applied to how to build a sukkah. So this is a flyer that was developed for an architectural competition called Sukkah City that took place in New York City in 2010. We'll actually see some of the results of this in a little bit in a short video. But what they tried to do was they tried to give these architects some basic guidelines. The sukkah is radically temporary architecture, permanently unfinished. The roof must be made of individual construction elements that are below 4 hands' breadth in width. That's a measurement of how wide a hand is. You see on the left here, the sukkah exists as an ancient archetype in Jewish tradition, recalling the homeless exodus through the desert and the festival of harvest and homecoming, a place to eat, sleep, study, think, feel, and be. You can feel the art crowd messaging there. The sukkah exists as a parametric network of design constraints and possibilities, of musts and mays and maybes. So then they begin to give you all these criteria for a sukkah. The roof can not be made of bundles of straw or sticks tied together, but untied straws or sticks might be okay. The walls must remain unshaken by a standard continuous wind. So they have to define how strong do the walls have to be. So not a gale force wind, it has to be rated to hurricanes, but it can't be blown over by a small wind. The roof cannot be made of utensils or anything functional when not part of a sukkah. It cannot reside over under any overhanging surface, including any part of a tree. So you can't have an awning that you simply put it over. There's a question in the chat about the numbers of animals being sacrificed. Are these rabbinic sort of fantasies? Well, these actually appear in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah. And so it's plausible that the priests did try to enforce this while they were ruling under the constraints of the Torah in that Second Temple period from about 500 BCE to, again, around 100 or 70 of the Common Era. And there are testimonies from Greek and Roman sort of tourist book scholars, as well as Josephus, who writes a little bit after the temple's destroyed, and rabbinic literature as well, that testify, and even the New Testament talks about all the animals coming to Jerusalem for the sacrifice. So it's plausible they were actually offering some version of this number of animals at these events.
Did they just burn them up? I mean,
Well, yeah, they're sacrificed in a certain way. Parts of them are burned up as a pleasing odor. Some sacrifices are complete burnt offerings. Others, the priests get the meat that's left over. So there's a complex system. Again, economists can have a field day with this. It also mentions the roof of a sukkah cannot be made of food. It can be made of almost anything that grows. It has to have a roof made of sakach, the leaves and or branches of a tree or plant. The sukkah must draw the eye up to its roof and the sky beyond. At night, one must be able to see the stars from within the sukkah through the roof, so you can't have a hermetically sealed roof. It has to be open with some holes. It can have 3 walls, but the third doesn't need to be complete. It must be at least 10 handbreadths tall, but no taller than 20 cubits. In a day, one must have more shade than sunshine. So they're coming up with all these rules to define it. And this is, by the way, a fraction of the rules. There's a whole section of the Talmud dedicated to the rules of the sukkah. But they gave the architects some basic rules. It has to be at least 10 tall, no taller than 20. They give you a basic definition of what a hand's breadth is. How far the base of the roof has to be from the ground. The roof must be made from something that once grew in the ground but is no longer attached to the earth. So again, you can actually cut the branches off the tree and put them on your roof, but you can't have them still attached to the tree. The 2 complete walls face each other. An incomplete wall can go perpendicular to that. You can build a sukkah on top of a sukkah, so you can do a duplex sukkah if you want to do that. A sukkah may be built on a camel or on a boat. I mean, if you're on a caravan, you're not going to stop in the middle of the desert. You build it on the camel. It can even be built in a tree like a tree house. It can be built on a wagon to travel. A whale may be used to make the walls of a sukkah even. And there is no maximum area except in New York City, where any structure larger than 9 by 8 is not considered temporary by the Department of Buildings. So they had a constraint building it in a park in New York that they couldn't go far. But the minimum area is 7 by 7 square handbreadths. But that's not that big. Imagine 7 handwidths aside, it's not going to be that big. One other way you can remember the possible shapes of the sukkah is the word sukkah is written with 3 letters. Remember, the vowel sounds are dots and dashes. So the samech is an S, the kaf is a K, and the hey is the ah, aspirated at the end. But notice you have 4 walls, 3 walls, and 2 walls, and a partial wall. So those are the possible shapes that you can use to make your sukkah. There's a lot of other rules as well. It says you will dwell in the sukkah, so you have to eat there, you have to drink there, you have to sleep there, you need to study there. There's even a discussion over how much rain getting into the sukkah is enough that you don't have to be in the sukkah, because you shouldn't risk your life by getting a cold. And they say basically, if you were in your house and there were water dripping through a hole in the roof and you'd move to another room, that's enough to move out of the sukkah. Now, they didn't necessarily contemplate whether in October in Chicago or Poland. Again, this is evolving in the Middle East, where it's much more temperate climate. Right, you're not dealing with snow at all. It's usually for a family. A household would have a sukkah.
The idea was you had it on the field and you were supposed to harvest.
Originally, it was a harvesting in the field, but now you've got them on rooftops, on balconies, and in places like that. And again, you may spend part of your time out there. You go and you eat your meals out there, but that doesn't mean you're there 24 hours a day. You just have to do symbolic, significant things that mark it as being dwelled in. They also help to define those 4 species of plants I mentioned before. And those get put together in a special object, which is called a lulav. That's the 3 green branches here that you see. And then the 4th species was defined as a special fruit, which is called an etrog. In English, is often translated as a citron. Or occasionally you'll see it listed as bergamot. Now, if you know anything about teas, Earl Grey tea is actually flavored with bergamot. And so if you smell an etrog and you smell an Earl Grey tea bag, they're similar. They're actually a related fruit. They're not exactly the same, but they're close enough that you get the feel for it. And so you've got the willow, branches on the left, the long, thin, slender leaves. You've got the date palm with the long, straight branches, and then you've got the willow, the myrtle, rather, which is somewhat fragrant on the right side here. And then what you're supposed to do with those 4 species is every person is supposed to acquire them themselves, and you're supposed to wave them to the north and the south and the east and the west at appropriate times with appropriate prayers, and you hold the lulav together with the etrog. And I will point out that here's someone holding them in the proper position as you're supposed to shake them. But, you can see it if you've got a long, straight piece and a round piece at the bottom. It has a vaguely, we'll say, phallic symbolism to it. Again, this is around the rainy season. We talked about Yom Kippur is leading into the rainy season. So you're going to shake this branch. It actually sounds like shh, almost like rain coming down. And it has a kind of imitative magic function to it. One other tradition the rabbis innovated with Sukkot was they told everyone to read a special book called the Book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is actually a work of wisdom literature that talks about how everything is impermanent and nothing lasts, and it's actually a book that's kind of depressing if you read it at the wrong time of day or in the wrong mood. But the point of Ecclesiastes is there's a time to be born and a time to die. He doesn't say turn, 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 but that's where the text is from. But when you're out there in nature and you're experiencing the world, you see the cycle of things and you realize you're part of something much bigger than yourself. In the Middle Ages, they added a tradition of imagining someone called ushpizin, or magical, mystical guests that would come and visit the sukkah. Traditionally, they were the patriarchs of the Bible: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, and David. There are 7 of them for the 7 nights that you're in the sukkah. And those special prayers where you invite them to join your sukkah, again, part of the mystical tradition that was added. Now, the connection with the Torah part of this is at the end of the holiday. On day 7, you have a special ritual marking the end of those 7 days living in the sukkah. It's called Hoshanah Rabbah, which means great save us prayers. You take the willow branches that came from your lulav and you strike the earth with them, and you actually have a procession around the temple saying, Hoshiana, Hoshiana, save us, please save us, to God. You take the Torah out for a very serious Torah procession, and you actually go 7 times around the bima, the platform, with the willow branches. So this is, again, looking for saving, and the speculation is that maybe the Day of Judgment was extended a bit, that the end of Sukkot is like really the last time that you can get your judgment averted from the Day of the Day of Judgment and the Book of Life. And so then the closing day is called Shemini Atzeret, which means the 8th closing. Remember, it was called an Atzeret, a closing day, and it highlighted that it was the 8th day, that's the last day of Sukkot. So that's called Shemini Atzeret, the concluding day. It has an echo of Yom Kippur to it, and there's a special prayer for rain that's offered as part of Shemini Atzeret. And then we get the holiday that Roger alluded to earlier. I may have mentioned earlier, when the rabbis were defining the calendar, they sometimes added an extra day because of the ambiguity between the 29th or 30th days when the moon would be seen and so on. And if you lived more than 2 weeks travel away from Jerusalem, you might not get word that the moon had been seen to know when the holiday started. So they would have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and 2 Seders for Passover for the first and second night. And 2 days of Shavuot are marked as well. And the end of Sukkot gets an extra day. So the second day for the end of Shemini Atzeret, that day we weren't sure of, became Simchat Torah, a celebration of the reading of the Torah cycle. The rabbis defined a set of 54 Torah portions, so that if you read 1 a week, and sometimes 2 a week depending on the week, you'll get through the entire Torah cycle in 1 Jewish year. And that cycle resets at Simchat Torah, where you read the last Torah portion at the end of Deuteronomy, and then you've got to roll the scroll all the way back to the other end to get to the beginning of Genesis. And in many congregations, they actually unroll the whole thing and have all the congregation holding it out really wide or in a very big circle in the sanctuary, and then they roll it back up so that it's queued up for Genesis, and they read that beginning again. So this is a celebration of the Torah in that setting, and this is seen as a very joyous event. So when you're doing your circles with the Torah scrolls, called the Hakafot, you're singing and dancing, and you'll see people actually in public also carrying Torah scrolls and dancing with them as part of this. Simchat Torah means simcha, joy, right? You're celebrating this cycle of reading resetting again.
And this is the second day, is like the 9th day?
It's actually the 9th day, day number 9, because day number 1 was a special festival to mark the beginning of Sukkot. Day number 7 is a special festival called Hoshanah Rabbah. Then you've got the 8th day that Torah prescribes as the Shemini Atzeret, the 8th closing day, but you've got the extra diaspora day for that, and that becomes Simchat Torah, which now is its own holiday, but at one time was just this sort of fill-in day. And Simchat Torah actually became an important holiday for Soviet Jewry as well. If you were around paying attention during the Refusnik era, Simchat Torah became a day that Soviet Jews would act on their public Jewish conviction. They might not have been deep Torah believers necessarily, but it was a symbol of active public Jewishness. Now, Sukkot in Israel is actually a great holiday because first of all, the schools are all off, and it's a really exciting time for Orthodox Jews because they can do things. They can't do anything on Rosh Hashanah because they can't break the rules. They can't do anything on Passover because the first 2 nights are like Shabbat. They can't do any work. But Sukkot, the middle days therein, and the middle days of Passover for that matter, are called Chol HaMoed, the sort of ordinary days in the middle of the festival. So they can go to museums and they can go to parks, and you see these Orthodox Jewish families all over the place because they're off of work, they're off of school, but they're able to do things because they're not limited by Shabbat rules. And Israel, it's a very popular holiday. Many people build sukkahs, including many secular Jews, on their balconies or on the roofs of their apartment buildings or houses. And again, of course, the kibbutzim, back to agriculture, were harvesting things. It was the fall harvest for them. So it was, again, an agricultural route for them. So what do we do here with it? Well, let me show you that video I promised of the creative sukkahs that were done for this contest called Sukkah City. Two walls and a roof.
Go to this one over here. What?
So you can have a lot of fun with it. It doesn't have to be old and boring and flat and, you know, not set up to be creative. So,
Rabbi, could you just explain to me the suspended log as a sukkah?
well, it had two walls that were made out of glass, you know, and a half wall on the other side, and the covering was something that was originally growing in the ground, and you can see the stars around it.
It just would be threatening.
I mean, you might be nervous, but yeah, in theory, you know, it meets the basic criteria. So, you know, I thought this was a really creative approach to this. You know, get artists who've never done this before. You can actually find online, someone made a documentary about the whole thing, and they interviewed the artists who made choices, and so they interviewed the guy who did the one with the all the homeless persons, you know, cardboard boxes as the walls, and because he wanted to highlight the idea of temporary housing and, you know, living out of doors and that kind of thing. So he paid them for their signs and was able to use those for the wall. So you can find a lot more about that particular initiative. But that's just one of many approaches we could take. You know, highlighting homelessness as a value can come out of that Sukkah experience. I mean, Ecclesiastes as a reading source is fantastic for humanistic Jews because it wonders whether there's really any cosmic justice after all. And in the end, it says the best thing we can do is enjoy our life while we're here and eat, drink, and be merry. And, you know, that's the best we can do, and try and seek wisdom. And maybe that will alleviate suffering to the best we can do with human power. And that's life. And then you die. So again, it's not necessarily uplifting, but it has some resonance with our philosophic approach. You know, reminding ourselves that problematic circumstances are temporary is certainly useful in the COVID times that we find ourselves in. You know, this too shall pass is something that we would like to see happen sooner than later, but it will happen because the times change, seasons cycle, and things move forward. So, any other thoughts on Sukkot or the complications therein?
And they break it up like 54 of them, as you say. So that's like almost 1 week or more than 1 week. Right. So during the high holidays, are they reading the end of Deuteronomy?
They're nearing the end of Deuteronomy, yes.
Okay, so because the actual Simchat Torah is actually like a week later or so, actually 2 weeks later.
Right.
Yeah. So the way that cycle goes, actually, the high holidays don't begin the new Torah reading; they're actually sort of the end of the Torah reading.
Right.
Okay.
You're running near the end as you get into the fall.
I don't know why I just thought like Rosh Hashanah was like the beginning of the new cycle, but it's not.
It's about 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually 3 weeks later because it's at the end of Sukkot. So Rosh Hashanah is on the 1st.
Right. That's
it's
right.
going to be like in the 20s, so it's almost 3 weeks later. Yeah, I mean the cycles don't necessarily line up. It's why rabbis, by the way, at the end of Simchat Torah are like collapsing because they've had to suffer for, you know, I mean, they've had to celebrate and lead all these Slichot prayers at the end of the high holidays, and then they've got the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, and before, then they've got Sukkot, then they've got Hoshanah Rabbah, then they've got Shmini Atzeret, then they've got Simchat Torah, and then, you know, enough already. And actually the next month, Cheshvan, has, other than Shabbat, there's an Ethiopian Jewish holiday, but there aren't any other major Jewish holidays in the month of Cheshvan, and the rabbis call that like, you know, recovery month because right, they get some time off.
So I had another question, which is, you may not know the answer to, but you mentioned that people circle it 7 times, they go around, what is it, the Sukkah?
No, the bima in the synagogue.
In the synagogue.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that have any relationship to the circle of the Kaaba? Because they do the same thing when they do the Hajj, you know, and they circle the. Is there a relationship there? Or do you know? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know that they're consciously related. We do know that Muhammad had some familiarity with this practice. I don't know if the Kaaba circling predates Muhammad, because the Kaaba was a shrine before Muhammad brought Islam. So, you know, that may have been part of the ritual then. I mean, look, you have a holy site, you're not allowed to step on it, but you can go around it. Like, you know, that could be a universal human kind of taboo ritual. And the number 7 is not unique to Jewish culture. And, you know, so it's hard to tell what's borrowing and what's just the human phenomenon of taboos and magic numbers.
It just struck me, that's all. Sorry.
No, it's definitely, definitely a parallel.
Think about these festivals. We have those three harvests: the spring harvest of Passover, the summer harvest of Shavuot, the fall harvest of Sukkot. We have a question that is always percolating in the back of our mind. When did the priests put their version of the holiday together? Because we had the agricultural period, which we imagine goes back a long way, and then we've got this priestly version as composed in the Torah, but when did that transition happen? And for two of these three festivals, we actually have some biblical record that suggests when they might have happened. So for Passover, you have to turn to the book of Kings, where you see the reformation of King Josiah, who is cleaning out the temple. And at the end of his cleaning out, we find a fascinating detail. So he reads a book that says we have to follow this covenant strictly. He takes out all the idols and burns them and kills the idolatrous priests and smashes the pillars and defiles places, gets rid of the horses given to the sun and defiles shrines facing Jerusalem, and so on and so on and so on. And then at the end of this chapter, he says, the king commanded all the people, offer the Passover sacrifice to Yahweh your God as prescribed in this Sefer Brit, in this scroll of the covenant. And what it admits here is, Ki lo na'aseh ka'pesach hazeh, this Passover sacrifice had not been offered like this, miyamei hashoftim, from the days of the judges, when they judged Israel. V'chol yamei malchei Yisrael u'malchei Yehuda, and all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. So for all those hundreds of years, if the judges period goes back to before the kings, that would be like 1200, 1100 BCE, all the way to King Josiah in 600, 620 or so BCE. So for those 500, 600 years, no one had done it right. No one had done it like this. Only in the 18th year of King Josiah was such a Passover sacrifice offered in that manner to Yahweh in Jerusalem. So when was Passover done the way we imagine it? Well, if Josiah discovers the book of Deuteronomy, which was what many scholars speculate he did, the book of Deuteronomy clearly connects Passover with the Exodus story, with the animal sacrifice, and so it may be that the version of Passover we think of as canonical is really from the time of King Josiah. That's when they put it together with the agricultural festivals. And we have a similar kind of admission in the book of Nehemiah about Sukkot. Nehemiah. Right. It's in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually a combined book, Ezra, Nehemiah. The Christian Bible splits it into Ezra and Nehemiah, but they're right next to each other. They're in the historical books near the end of the Hebrew Bible. And the Old Testament's ordered differently. They put the prophets at the end to prefigure Jesus, and it's a whole long story we'll talk about when we talk about Bible canons. So in the beginning of chapter 8, the entire people assemble as one man in the square before the water gate. And there actually was a water ritual attached to Sukkot we didn't have time to talk about, but that was a special water libation was part of the Sukkot festival. So the water gate makes sense here. They ask Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the teaching of Moses. So now we have the Sefer Torat Moshe. Here it's called the book of the scroll, the Torah of Moses, explicitly. On the first day of the 7th month, he read to everybody who could listen with understanding. He read from light until midday to the men and women and those who could understand. They were all given to the scroll of the teaching. He stood on a tower with all these attendants near him. He lifted up the scroll for all the people to see. He blessed Yahweh. They said, Amen, Amen, and bowed down. And all the Levites explained the teaching to the people. Even then they didn't get it. So the teachers had to explain what it meant. They read from the scroll. And then they say, on the second day they read again. And they found written, as if they'd never seen it before, they found written in the teaching that Yahweh had commanded Moses, the Israelites must dwell in booths during the festival of the 7th month. Basukot. Yeshvu basukot, even the same verbs it's used in the Torah description. And they must announce and proclaim throughout all their towns, go to the mountains and bring branches of olive trees, pine trees, myrtles, palms, and other leafy trees to make the booths. So now it even tells you what to do with those branches. Before, it just said, get the branches. Now it says, make the booths out of the, not a lulav, by the way, but make your booth out of these branches, it says. The people went and brought them and made themselves booths on their roofs and their courtyard, in the courtyards of the house of God, in the Watergate Square and Ephraim Gate Square. The whole community that returned from captivity made booths. The Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua the son of Nun. Joshua son of Nun, he was the one that followed right after Moses. So you're telling me from basically since the Exodus, and Moses dies before they enter the Promised Land, they've never done Sukkot in all those 700 years we're talking now, from, say, Exodus around 1200 to return from exile in Babylon around 500. So for those 700 years, they haven't done Sukkot. And for most of that time, they weren't doing Passover either. What kind of holidays are they running here? You know, what kind of a Judaism is this with no Passover and no Sukkot? But here again, it's an admission. I mean, look, in theory, they could have really just forgotten it, right? They were given it to Moses. It was given to Moses, and even though they studied Torah, they never did it exactly right, and now they finally got it right for the first time. That's possible. I would argue, however, it's much more likely that this is an innovation, that they're dating back and claiming it goes back to that time we've finally rediscovered the Sefer Torah Moshe, the book of the Torah of Moses, and we're claiming what's new is old. And the reason why I bring these texts at the end of this conversation on the festivals is it actually legitimizes exactly what we do today with these holidays. There's a Jewish tradition of transforming your cultural inheritance to fit new values and stories. It was done, even admitted, in the Hebrew Bible for Passover and Sukkot when they were innovated by these people who claim to be restoring an old version of the past. We're just a little more honest, I would say. When we're making changes, we say this is different. But the fact that we're changing and that holidays are evolving and adding new meaning is part of a very old Jewish tradition.